Okay, well, it's good to be here. Thank you to Stinder for the introduction. It's actually fantastic listening to all the talks and the shared interest in the kinds of questions that I want to talk about today. Thank you. So, what am I going to talk about? Well, firstly, in my work, I'm interested in concept formation. And I think what is very interesting in relation to the questions raised here, but also more generally the contemporary situation of LLMs, is that a whole series of concepts are distributed and used in various networks and constellations of meanings that I think are very important to critique and understand. They tend to be used a priori in many ways, which is obviously very problematic. And in the kinds of approaches that I take towards historicising ideas and understanding and contextualising the development of ideas, LLMs, as it were, form a very interesting probe to think about these kinds of questions. We could articulate this, I think, in terms of a Mannheimian notion of a thought style. I think that's quite a good way to think about it. Now, one of the things that really has caught my attention lately, and I'm developing a working project on this at the moment, is the kind of idea of a kind of prescriptivism within ethical frameworks for AI, particularly in what has come to be called constitutional AI or principles-based AI. And so what I'm trying to do really is work through this notion to pull it apart. And this is really important, it's not that I want to implement constitutional AI or that I think it is the answer to all the questions. No, what I'm interested in is the concept formation and the value propositions that lie around this contemporary formation. And of course, you know, very much speaking to the way in which we think about these things at this conference, you know, a highly interdisciplinary approach is required to work through these kinds of questions. Now, what's wonderful, I think, about this notion of constitutional AI is it speaks very strongly to a kind of running theme of this question of automation versus augmenting the human, and kind of in a very interesting way rehearses and replays previous debates. Almost, and I think this is kind of like a classic situation in technology development, almost forgetting its own history or the history of critiques of particular technical ways of doing things. And I think that's very interesting to kind of bring that forward. So, for example, you know, when we think about the kind of value questions, the ethical questions, the moral questions, if you prefer, around the use of computational systems, you would think, would you not, that humans would be an important part of that conversation, whether that be independently, in collaboration with, or somehow framing sociologically the implementation of these systems. I.e., you'd think humans would have to be in the loop in these discussions or in the creation and design of these notions of a constitution for AI. However, and no surprise, I suppose, in many ways, actually humans are seen as a limiting and somewhat inefficient supplier of moral and ethical values. Something, as it were, that gets in the way of producing these kind of LLM systems. Humans don't scale well, I suppose, is one way of putting that. Now, I think this also speaks to another thing that's running through the conference, really, is this notion of, Polanyi's notion, of course, of tacit knowing, right? Relating the particular to the comprehensive, or his classic phrase, we know more than we tell. And I think that's really, really important when you're thinking about the design of an ethical constitution, that an ethical constitution is, by definition, a series of particulars that cannot capture the comprehensive. And that, as it were, lies as a paradox fundamentally and foundationally in the design of these systems. And we're starting to see the outcome of these kinds of debates and these kinds of implementations, and of course we will expect and will see huge conflicts and contradictions in these systems as they are put into operation. And certainly that's something to look out for. So what is a constitution? Well, a constitution for an AI really is a kind of specification document. It's kind of interesting in its structure, actually, a quite puzzling, a rather odd documentary trace that is just a kind of wonderful way of stepping into some of the debates in constitutional AI. It gives us actually quite an interesting material artifact to work with when we're kind of looking at these systems. And of course, the reliance on, as it were, a written constitution, on a material form that captures a certain set of values, is that it falls within this question of tacit knowing. It requires this wider context within which the constitution has to be interpreted. Right? And that's crucially important because, of course, LLMs have no reader and certainly have no tacit knowing. So the disconnect is strong. So one way of thinking about this that I've been playing with is really these constitutions, these principles, are in effect a kind of ethical programming language for the LLMs. And actually, it's kind of interesting to look at the way in which they're being articulated in the literature. Although no one actually says this explicitly, implicitly, you can kind of see it starting to happen in practice. And interestingly, how does one get this kind of principle-based, written, artifactual evidence to put into these systems? Or, in another way of putting it, how does one get access to the expertise requirement of the constitutional AI? Well, actually, this is quite interesting, because it's almost like a return to the knowledge elicitation debates of the 1980s and 1990s, and also speaks interestingly to Dreyfus's description of AIs as world poor and the problems of the lacking of a space of meaning in relation to the construction of these systems. So you can see by the way in which I'm setting this up, the constitutional AI acts as a kind of, well, very useful critical probe, really, into understanding this particular constellation of ideas and concepts for, as it were, producing LLMs today, right? It's a contemporary social question. It's a kind of very hot topic. Lots of money rolling around and lots of concern about it at multiple levels through society. So it's a real problem. So it shows us this very interesting contemporary moment, but it also, I think, speaks very interestingly to kind of wider questions about how computational structures embed particular kinds of human notions and how they're operationalized. And I'll come to that shortly. So maybe to give you a very quick example of this, Hugging Face, for example, are using John Dewey's work to create ethical charters, as they call them, ethical charters which, and this is to quote them, moral exercise to make, and that's very interesting, a moral exercise, I kind of find that very interesting, to make explicit the values of a particular project, thus empowering collaborators and bring them together under the same normative umbrella. Very interesting language, I think. Again, the writing of an ethical charter is a moral exercise, the sharing of values, etc., etc., etc. And again, you know, we see this very fascinating and in many ways quite naive notion that ethical or moral values can be elicited problematically for a computational system. And here, of course, as a joke, you know, it is interesting, this attempt to have this collective process of computational writing, but I suspect that the temptation of automation will be strong in these kind of projects, such that you get a kind of a moral exercise that's, you know, run once, run everywhere, right? They're not going to do this for every single LLM they produce. They'll do one constitution and that'll be the end of it, historically. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with the concept of alignment, this notion of, which is itself, you know, a superbly interesting concept to unpack. But essentially it's this idea of aligning a computer model with human norms and values. So I'm going to very briefly just introduce two that I found quite interesting. The first is really a kind of a prescriptive framework, a prescriptive constitution, which if you haven't seen them, is genuinely quite interesting to see. And I've also got one of Apple's ones that's almost hacked out of the new Apple Intelligence system. And the second is, again, probably you're very familiar with, is the notion of cake or death, a kind of AI game that, again, is about really teaching the AI in a kind of humorous way, I guess, that cake for humans is better than death. Right, so, you know, this very simplistic and binary way of understanding. So I'm not going to go through this slide, but this notion of aligned, it's got a kind of very interesting history to it, and how people, kind of have a catastrophic notion of underlying systems, this kind of a strange language around it, I think. And, it's also very interesting to look at the way in which people working on the project, this was actually ChatGPT, or what was not yet ChatGPT, was being red teamed. If you haven't seen this interview with this red teamer, it's absolutely amazing. Really, really recommend you watch it. But he was asked really to kind of red team ChatGPT before they had a kind of constitution, if you like. And some of the things it would do for him was explain and give detailed instructions for creating mass casualty events, so attacking people, targeted political assassinations, and detailed ways of actually undertaking a series of targeted interventions for political change, i.e. listing the key people, how to attack them, what their habits were, and so on and so forth. Quite insane detail. So you can understand why OpenAI, for example, got very concerned about these kinds of possibilities, and why constitutional AI has become such an interesting way of dealing with that. So I won't have time to talk about the risk, etc., but just to say there is always this very odd, catastrophic notion of machines running out of control that lies behind a lot of the debates at the moment, and obviously that needs to be calmed in some way to get an understanding of these systems. So let's first look at an example from Anthropic. I'll give you a few seconds to have a look at that. I just think it's interestingly textual. Right? I think that's very, very fascinating. And again, as an artifact that limits or provides an ethical prescriptive framework for an AI to operate, it's kind of strange, actually. You can see why this notion of an ethical programming language kind of makes sense in some ways. There's so much to be thought about here, but, the notion that one can just say, choose the response that's harmless, choose the response that's helpful, avoid toxicity, avoid racism. It's kind of interestingly begs the question and comes back to that, I think, interesting Polyanian notion. Here is Apple's that was hacked out in 2024. Very, very similar. This kind of written series of guidances, prescriptive statements in order to shape the AI. Of course, Apple's not undertaking any kind of deliberative process to do this. It's purely instrumental. But nonetheless, it's very suggestive, I think. And a quick picture of cake or death, and how cake or death is used to teach LLMs that, generally speaking, for humans, death is a bad thing. Again, very fascinating in terms of teaching the system ethical life, as it were. I do also want to just point very, very briefly to the notion that alignment has been very strongly a part of discussions in effective altruism. I'm sure you're very familiar with this. And also, of course, ethical altruism itself has become very controversial, not just in its problematic kind of starting points in terms of its ideas and its catastrophism. In fact, they're often called the doomers, which is quite nice, as opposed to the very recent emergence of the effective accelerationists, who draw very heavily on Nick Land, another problematic character, of course, and they're the boomers, pro-technology, or the techno-optimists, as Andreas calls himself. And of course, Oxford recently closed its effective altruism research lab for reasons we won't go into here, but of course are very controversial. This is really, this whole, what seems like quite an obscure discussion, I don't know if it's a philosophical discussion, but certainly a discussion, is very interestingly brought to the fore by the big fallout in OpenAI in 2023, when Sam Altman was almost thrown out of the company, a boardroom coup, allegedly by the effective altruists. And of course, the other famous case is Sam Bankman-Fried, who was convicted of massive fraud and has to pay $11 billion in recompense. Good luck getting your money back when it's that large, I reckon. But nonetheless, interesting because he was one of the key funders of Anthropic, one of the big proponents of constitutional AI. So these threads have to be mapped, and of course I won't be able to do that here. And to kind of summarise really the big debate is whether you have a kind of a priori prescriptive definition, a foundational definition of what your ethical principles are, as opposed to some kind of learned feedback mechanism into the AI, and it comes to some kind of ethical realization, as it were, in quotations. So you can see then that looking at this notion of constitution in relation to AI allows us to kind of map out the kind of concept formation that takes place, or in real time is taking place, in relation to this wider problematic. And this concept formation is a historical mapping, a historical constellation, and so that makes it very interesting to tie into other debates and also to understand the way in which the technology sector takes on and uses concepts from elsewhere. Very often today, of course, the political sphere takes on concepts from computer science and unproblematically relates them to the state or to political process. So government as a platform, for example, government as software, government having bugs. Here we get that very rare moment, I think, where it happens in the other way around, where a political concept is being imported into technology and being used with the kind of connotations of constitution writing that it would have in a political area. So, of course, in the social sciences, we're all very familiar with these kinds of questions, these assumptions, these concepts, how techniques are connected together in particular ways to create particular outcomes, and, of course, the knock-on effect of power and power structures in shaping these. And we mustn't forget that political economic moment in particular. A lot of money is at stake here. I saw that, was it yesterday or a few days ago, OpenAI is currently trying to raise $6.5 billion of cash based on $150 billion valuation, and people are saying that's too cheap, right? This is a, yeah, the numbers are insane, but very interesting. And of course, that allows us to make these connections which are so important between capitalism and the technology industries and these kinds of altruistic or so-called altruistic methods of presentation. We can look behind, as it were, the kind of, shall we say, to use a computational metaphor, behind the interface of AI to see the Californian ideology that lies behind. But I think it's really, really interesting. You know, I don't want to suggest that this doesn't matter. It matters a lot. And mapping out these kinds of ideas and their incorporation and implementation in code is very, very important. So the approach that I'm bringing to this is what's called critical code studies. Some of you may not be familiar with this. But essentially, it's an attempt to work closely with the computational functioning of software in that it can reveal certain embedded contextual issues that may seem like technical or scientific processes. This is very kind of standard humanistic or social scientific interpretative approach. And what I like very much about this approach is its willingness to incorporate the paratextual, the contextual more generally, if you like. So social context, wide range of commentary, even social media itself can be incorporated in the interpretative moment of working with a particular software artifact. And it's kind of ideal for this kind of project. Really? 5 minutes?
I'm allowed 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, right, okay. 7 minutes, okay. Well, this is going to be very, very difficult to do this. Okay, so I will take 10. Okay, I'm going to actually set an alarm so that I don't go over. Okay, thank you for that. So you can see that artificial intelligence and machine learning offers a new kind of problematic here. It was all very well for us to be working with code, and even access to code was itself problematic, because often code isn't available, code is proprietary, code is difficult to read, and so on and so forth. And I'll hopefully be able to very quickly jump to some examples of that later. But essentially, the way in which I'm approaching it is a threefold approach, i.e. we have this kind of technical moment of reading, we have this hermeneutic moment of reading, and then we have this kind of critical theory or emancipatory moment of reading. That helps us to understand and work through the problematics associated with these highly technical and complex artifacts. So I'm not going to go into the detail of what critical code studies does. I recommend you go and have a look at that. But what I do want to do is turn to these questions of constitutional alignment and how it works through the connection between principles and language, language and constitution, and then, of course, in terms of software in and of itself. Now, what I found very interesting is this political language is used on problematically. Here's a quote from Anthropic: drafting a constitution. Doesn't that sound great? Drafting a constitution. Right, drafting a constitution for powerful IEC could's doing a lot of work here, be a democratic process, right? And, the idea that essentially one could bring people together into this arena and work out what are the kind of values in society we want our IAs to have. It seems to have a lot of promise. And, of course, that's what's being sold. And these are some of the questions that I think are kind of very important. How was the Constitution written for a particular LLM? Where was it written? In what language? Often in English, very interestingly. I haven't seen yet any other languages being used. Why was it written? How were the authors organised? What are the practicalities of writing this? What's their legitimacy? That's not often discussed in this literature, which is very, very interesting. What is in the Constitution? What's left out? What are the absences in the Constitution? Who owns it, right? Copyright, political economy, money, very important. Who can change it? Again, they don't seem to be dynamic documents. They're often fixed. What's the mechanism of change? And this is really, classic kind of political science critiques of constitution writing, but are absent when it comes to these kinds of systems. Okay, so what I want to do, I want to very, very quickly just connect that to various democratic principles. Here I'm thinking about Fishkin, for example, the notion of deliberative debate, how you could incorporate some of these processes, not that these have happened necessarily so far, but there are some interesting developments, and I'm just going to touch them. Collective constitutional AI, ethical childbirth we've already looked at from Hugging Face, alignment assemblies. I mean, these are all quite interesting and quite sort of voguish terms. We've also got some very interesting moments of kind of real participatory involvement. Ada Lovelace, for example, UNESCO, AI for the people, various mechanisms and techniques for doing these kinds of things. And of course, there's various national models as well. Canada and Finland, for example, have done various things there. So, in the remaining 6 minutes and 22 seconds, I just want to connect to what I think is interesting in relation to these questions is to look backwards to look forwards, as it were. Some of you know that I'm already doing this work with ELIZA, and it is so fascinating because it is the AI project, right? It is as it were, the ancestor of many of the debates that are going forward today, and many of them raised by Weizenbaum himself in his work. Now, of course, one has to be careful about being presentist about this. There are real specificities to the way in which ELIZA was produced, and that in itself is an absolutely amazing and interesting question. So, no screens, no hard drives, very different world of writing software when ELIZA was created. But what is absolutely fascinating is ELIZA and Weizenbaum's reaction to it and its reception as this kind of chatbot AI system that would solve so many problems unproblematically. And this collective hallucination, if you like, around the possibilities of giant brains being operative in our society. Rather similar to where we are now, right? Weizenbaum, one of the things that really concerned him was therapeutic and psychotherapeutic attempts to use ELIZA, and there were some, let's just be clear, it was used in various hospitals in the US to treat patients with mental illness, and he was very concerned about this, understandably. And if you have a look on the App Store, you'll see many pieces of software that are currently doing just this, offering well-being and therapy and all sorts of very strange things with LLMs that have no legitimacy, no information, very hard to figure out what's going on here. So this was a shock to Weizenbaum, and also very interesting that he calls on Polanyi as well in order to explain why it's so important that we get a grip on these things. This is 1976, so very, very interesting. So, ELIZA is absolutely fascinating. Of course, you all know about Doctor. Now, the interesting thing about this is that as part of this project I'm working on, everyone knows ELIZA, pretty much. Certainly if you've done anything to do with computation, you know about ELIZA. Everyone's probably used ELIZA, played with it on a website or used the software or written one themselves. But in reality, nobody has seen the source code because the source code went missing and has been missing for nearly 60 years. The original ELIZA, no one has seen it. It just went missing. That absence in and of itself is totally fascinating and shows the importance of the materiality of the things we are studying. Because without that source code, we had the algorithm, right? We had the output of the algorithm. We didn't have the source code. We assumed how it functioned, right? We had ideas about how ELIZA worked. And because we had to rely on Weizenbaum's interpretation, we tended to trust Weizenbaum's description of it. And we'll come to that in just a second about how, in many ways, Weizenbaum is an unreliable narrator of the software that he created, if I have time. So, firstly, we discovered it in 2021 in the MIT archives, just sitting there. Incredible that nobody had found it. Just mad. But then there are like 300 versions of ELIZA on the internet alone, right? So no surprise, no one. I should just say, Bernie Kosel never saw the original source code for ELIZA, right? Jeff Schrager never saw. These are the two people who created the kind of most popular versions of ELIZA. They never saw the source code, right? So that's very, very interesting. Okay, let's get down to the meat of it then. There you go, there it is. You're seeing it not for the first time because I've showed this before, but you're one of the very few people who've seen it. It's also on the internet. I'm being attacked by flies as well. So do have a look at it. And we have a website for it, findingeliza.org. Please do have a look at it. But what I want to get to is a couple of little facts. The original ELIZA source code is only 411 lines long. Amazing piece of software, really. Quite incredible. The way it functions is really incredible. I haven't got time to go through those technical details, but it really is quite astonishing. It's also Turing complete, which the computer scientists I work with on this project are absolutely obsessed with, I have to say. But it's a Turing complete scripting system. And there are at least 5 versions of ELIZA, not one, all developed by Weizenbaum at different times with different functionality. These 5 ELIZAs worked differently. That's also pretty interesting. And the later ones got quite sophisticated. I just want to quickly flash up this in my remaining seconds. It wasn't just Doctor, the script. We found a whole bunch of scripts in the archives that haven't been seen for 60 years. And perhaps one of the most interesting is the Spax script, which is software to teach Barry Spack's poetry to a student. Really interesting and totally forgotten. Here's our annotations working through the code, the importance of materiality again, very important if we're working with constitutional AI, get to the material object. Here's the Doctor source code, again, very interesting. But what I want to show you is this. This is probably my last slide because I have no time left, well, 45 seconds. This is an early version of that most famous Doctor output, the one you've probably seen, described as a distressed young lady talking to ELIZA. Recorded in the CACM paper in 1966, the one where she talks about her boyfriend forcing her to come here, that she has problems with her father, and so on and so forth. Well, in the archives, if anyone remembers the script, this is very similar, but not the same. That's really strange, right? This is a man with a very similar structure and the same kind of responses, talking about his wife, having children, and so on and so forth. And somewhere that becomes a distressed young lady, right? Now, I don't want to say Weizenbaum's editing this stuff for effect, except that we have hand annotations of him literally editing this for effect. Absolutely fascinating. So the question we have is, did he literally make up the conversation for the kind of effect it would have when it was published? Very, very fascinating. And that remains part of our research project that we're looking at. So I think on that note, I'll leave it there and open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much for